The day my stepfather looked me dead in the eye across the conference table and said, "You don't belong here, Iris. You never did." I almost believed him. Almost. The room smelled like expensive coffee and old money. 14 people sat around that mahogany table. Lawyers, board members, my stepfather's golf buddies in their navy blazers, and every single one of them watched him say it. Nobody flinched. A few of them nodded, like he'd just made a reasonable point about quarterly projections. My half-brother, sitting to my stepfather's left, was already looking at his phone, done with me before I even opened my mouth. I gathered my folder, stood up, and walked out. I didn't slam the door. I didn't cry until I got to the parking garage, and even then it was only for about 45 seconds. I gave myself exactly 45 seconds because that was all I could afford. I had work to do. Let me back up. My mother died when I was 9. Breast cancer, fast and merciless. She was 34. After she was gone, my father, my real father, he tried. He really did. But he was a mechanic who worked 60 hours a week just to keep the lights on. And grief does something terrible to a man who wasn't built to carry it alone. By the time I was 12, he'd married again. Her name was Diane, and she came with a son, Victor, who was 3 years older than me and had already decided that anything that wasn't his was a threat. My stepfather, Gerald Whitmore, entered the picture when I was 15. My father's drinking had gone bad by then. Gerald was my aunt's neighbour, a commercial real estate developer with a firm handshake and a way of making every room feel like he owned it. He started coming around. He offered to help my father with some debt, then with more debt, then slowly, so slowly I almost didn't notice, he helped my father right out of his own house. By the time I was 17, Gerald had married Diane, moved her and Victor into a 4-bedroom in Scottsdale, and I was living in a converted garage apartment behind my aunt's place in Phoenix. I was told this was temporary. I was told a lot of things that turned out not to be true. I worked through high school, waitressing, filing at a dental office, babysitting on weekends. I got a partial scholarship to Arizona State and paid the rest myself. I graduated with a degree in finance and a chip on my shoulder the size of the Sonoran Desert. I went to work at a mid-sized investment firm called Meridian Capital. I was quiet. I was precise. I learned everything I could about how money moves, how deals close, how leverage works. Gerald, meanwhile, had built Whitmore Development as something real. Commercial properties, a few residential developments, a strip mall portfolio that stretched across 3 states. Victor had joined the company at 22 with a title that had no business being on his resume. The company was worth somewhere around $40 million and growing. Nobody in that family gave me a second thought. That was their first mistake. When I was 28, I got a call from a man named Mr. Aldrich, a senior partner at a private equity firm called Copperline Group. He'd seen my work on a restructuring deal I'd led at Meridian. He wanted to talk. We talked for 3 hours. I joined Copperline 6 weeks later. I'm not going to walk through every detail of the next 4 years, because some of it is genuinely complicated and some of it is mine to keep. But here's what matters. Copperline operated in distressed commercial real estate. We found companies that were over-leveraged, undermanaged, or both, and we either fixed them or absorbed them. I was good at it. I was very, very good at it. And somewhere in year 2, I started seeing a pattern in some of the portfolios we were evaluating. Properties in Phoenix, Scottsdale, Tempe, familiar addresses, an office park off Camelback Road where I used to catch the bus to my first waitressing job, a strip mall in Mesa where my aunt used to get her hair done. Whitmore Development was in trouble. I didn't go looking for it. I want to be clear about that. The deal came to us through a broker, flagged as a distressed asset package, 3 commercial properties with deteriorating lease structures and an ownership group that I'd been burning cash trying to refinance at the wrong time. Standard stuff. Our junior analyst pulled the ownership docs and put the summary on my desk on a Tuesday morning in March. I read the name and I sat very still for a long time. Then I called Mr. Aldrich into my office and told him I had a conflict of interest disclosure to make. He listened. He looked at me across his desk. Then he said, "Do you want to lead this one or do you want me to pull you off it?" I said, "I want to lead it." He nodded once, then be clean, every step. I was clean, every step. The process took 14 months. Copperline acquired the distressed debt, about $12 million worth, from Whitmore's primary lender, who was exhausted and ready to be done with the whole situation. Once we held the debt, we had leverage. Real leverage, not the social kind Gerald had always wielded over people like my father, but the kind that shows up in legal documents and can't be charmed away with a firm handshake. During those 14 months, I kept working. I kept my head down. I moved into a clean but modest apartment in Tempe, drove a 6-year-old Honda, and bought my clothes at Ann Taylor clearance racks. If Gerald or Victor had ever bothered to look me up, they would have seen nothing worth worrying about. An analyst at a private equity firm. Renting. Unremarkable. They never looked me up. The meeting I mentioned at the beginning, the one where Gerald told me I didn't belong there, that was month 11. I had requested a seat at a restructuring discussion under the pretense of representing a creditor's interest, which was technically true. I was representing a creditor's interest. The creditor was Copperline. Copperline was mine to run by that point in all the ways that mattered. Mr. Aldrich had stepped back to an advisory role. I walked into that room knowing exactly what I held. Gerald didn't know who he was talking to. He thought I was still the garage apartment girl, the scholarship kid, the one they'd phased out of Christmas cards without anyone saying it out loud. When he told me I didn't belong there, I said nothing. I wrote one thing on my notepad, the total outstanding debt figure, folded the paper and slid it across the table to his attorney. Then I left. I gave myself 45 seconds in the parking garage. Then I drove back to the office and finalized the last of the paperwork. 3 weeks later, Gerald received a formal notice from Copperline Group outlining our position as the primary debt holder and proposing a restructuring meeting. His attorney called our office 6 times that day. I returned the call myself at 4:30 in the afternoon from my desk with a cup of coffee I'd made in the break room kitchen. I said, "Hello, this is Iris. I believe you've been trying to reach us." There was a pause. Then, "Irisy, you're at Copperline." "I run Copperline Southwest Acquisitions," I said. "I've been the lead in the Whitmore file for over a year. Did Gerald not mention I'd be involved?" Another pause. Longer this time. "I'll have him call you back," he said. Gerald never called back himself. He sent Victor. I almost felt sorry for Victor. Almost. He came into the meeting in a suit that cost more than my monthly rent and sat down across from me with that same look he'd had since we were teenagers, like he was tolerating an inconvenience. He brought 2 of Gerald's attorneys. I brought one of mine, a woman named Miss Park who had a quiet voice and a gift for making the other side feel like they were already losing before she'd said anything of substance. Victor opened with a number. It was low. It was insultingly low. Ms. Park didn't respond. She just opened her folder and placed a single document on the table facing Victor. A full accounting of the debt, the maturity timeline, the current market assessment of the collateral, and our proposed terms. Victor looked at the paper. He looked at me. He said, "You can't actually do this." "I already did," I said. He pushed back from the table. "Does Gerald know you're behind this?" "He does now," I said. Victor left without shaking anyone's hand. I watched him through the glass conference room wall as he stood in a lobby with his phone pressed to his ear, pacing back and forth. I watched him stop pacing. I watched his shoulders drop. I turned back to Ms. Park and asked if she wanted more coffee. The thing about this story that I've never been able to explain clearly to anyone is that it wasn't about revenge. Not really. Or not only. I've thought about it a lot, especially in the months after everything's settled, and I keep coming back to the same thing. I didn't set out to destroy Gerald Whitmore. I set out to be good enough at my job that when he crossed my path again, I would be standing on solid ground. He crossed my path. I was standing on solid ground. The outcome wasn't something I engineered from scratch. It was something I was ready for when it arrived. Gerald came to see me himself, eventually. Not at the office. He came to my apartment unannounced on a Saturday morning in October. I opened the door in sweatpants with a coffee mug in my hand, and I watched his face do something complicated when he took in the ordinary apartment, the used furniture, the total absence of the empire he probably expected to find. He said, "I didn't know it was you running that fund." I said, "I know." Iris? He stopped. He actually looked old to me, standing in my doorway. Not the version of him I'd carried around in my head for 15 years. Just an old man in a fleece jacket who'd made a lot of bad decisions and was finally out of runway. I want you to know that I never intended for things to go the way they did with your father, with you. I held my coffee mug with both hands. I thought about the garage apartment. The 45-second rule. 14 months of paperwork and patience. I believe you didn't intend for me to end up where I did, I said finally. But you also didn't do anything to change it, and there's a difference between what you intended and what you chose. He didn't have an answer for that. Neither of us said anything for a moment. Then he nodded once and said he'd have his attorneys reach out about the final terms. I said that would be fine. I wished him a safe drive home. I closed the door and stood in my quiet apartment for a while, looking at nothing in particular. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, a neighbour was mowing their lawn. I drank the rest of my coffee standing by the window watching the street below. The ordinary Saturday morning moving through ordinary lives, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel, not triumph. Not satisfaction, exactly. More like the specific quietness that comes when a very long chapter finally reaches its last page, and you realise you're still standing, and the next chapter is entirely yours to write. The restructuring closed in December. Whitmore Development was absorbed into Copperline's portfolio. Victor took a position with a competitor in Dallas. Gerald retired. Diane sent me a Christmas card, the first one in years, with a brief, careful note that said she hoped I was well and that she was sorry things had been the way they were. I read it twice. I put it in a drawer instead of the trash. My father called me around the same time. He'd gotten sober 3 years earlier and we'd been slowly, carefully rebuilding something. He'd read about the Copperline deal in a local business publication. He didn't say much. Just, "I'm proud of thee, kiddo." Then after a pause, "I'm sorry I wasn't better." I told him he was doing better now. That it counted. There's one more thing. A few months after everything closed, I got a voicemail from an unknown number. A woman's voice, hesitant, like she'd almost hung up twice before deciding to finish the message. She said her name was Renata. She'd been a leasing manager at one of the Whitmore properties, a small office complex in Mesa, and had been let go 2 years ago after raising concerns about some financial irregularities she'd seen in the lease accounting. She'd been looking into what had happened to the company and had found an article about Copperline's acquisition. She wanted to know if the new management would be willing to speak with her about what she'd seen. I called her back the next morning. She was exactly who she said she was. She'd kept records. She was thorough and quiet and careful in the way that people are when they've been burned for doing the right thing and aren't sure if it's safe to try again. I listened to everything she said. I took notes. I connected her with Mrs. Park and with an employment attorney I trusted. She got her settlement. It wasn't life-changing money, but it was fair and more importantly, it was acknowledged. Someone finally looked at what she'd seen and said, yes, that was real, that was wrong, that happened. She sent me a handwritten note afterward. I have it on my desk still, next to my coffee mug. It says simply, "Thank you for picking up the phone." That's the part I think about most, not the conference room, not Gerald in my doorway, not the final numbers in the closing documents. Just picking up the phone, calling back, deciding that what someone else saw and experienced was worth your time and your attention, even when it would have been easier to move on. My mother would have liked that part, I think. She was that kind of person, the kind who picked up the phone. I don't remember everything about her, not after all this time. But I remember that. I tried to be that kind of person too. I thought a lot about what actually made the difference. Not the deal, not the documents, not the moment Victor pushed back from that conference table. Those were just the visible part. What made the difference started much earlier, in choices nobody saw. When Gerald told me I didn't belong, he was measuring me by what I had. I was measuring myself by what I was building. That gap between how someone sees you and who you're quietly becoming, that's where everything important happens. I think a lot of people never find out what lives in that gap because they stop building the moment someone tells them they're not worth the effort. I didn't stop, not because I'm special, but because I'd already decided somewhere around age 17 in that garret apartment, that the way other people treated me was data about them, not a verdict about me. That sounds simple. It wasn't simple to live. There were nights I doubted it completely, but I kept deciding it over and over until it stopped being something I had to convince myself of and started being something I just knew. The work itself taught me something else. 14 months on the Whitmore file, every step documented and clean, taught me that integrity isn't a soft quality, it's a structural one. Mr. D, it's a structural one. Aldrich said be clean every step, and I was, not because I was afraid of getting caught doing otherwise, but because I understood that the whole thing collapses without it. You can't build something that lasts on a foundation you're ashamed of. Gerald built Whitmore development on leverage and charm and cutting corners on people who couldn't push back. That's not a business strategy, it's a countdown. I watched the countdown reach 0 from the other side of a mahogany table. And then there was Renata. Her call was the one I almost let go to voicemail. I was busy. The deal was closed. There was no professional reason I had to pick up, but I picked up and I listened and I connected her with people who could actually help, because what she had seen was real and she deserved to have someone treat it that way. She sent me a handwritten note. I still have it. I think about it more than I think about the closing documents. Here's what I've come to believe. The outcomes in our lives tend to follow the choices we make when nobody's watching and nothing is guaranteed. Iris, the waitress, exhausted after a double shift and still opening a finance textbook at midnight. That Iris built this, not the Iris sitting across from Victor in a conference room. The visible moment is almost always the last 5% of something invisible that took years. Gerald never understood that about me. He saw the garage apartment and stopped looking. That was his real mistake, not the bad debt, not the over-leveraged portfolio. He stopped looking at a person who hadn't stopped growing, and by the time he looked again, she was holding the paper that described everything he owed. I don't want people to walk away from my story thinking the point is to outlast your enemies. The point is to become someone worth becoming. Someone with the integrity to do the work honestly, the clarity to keep learning even when the lesson is hard, and the endurance to stay in the room even when every voice in it is telling you to leave. The rest has a way of following. Renata's note says thank you for picking up the phone. Some days I think that's the whole story, condensed into 7 words.